In 911 CE, two former enemies faced each other in a peace ceremony. Rollo was the head of an army of Norsemen, or Northmen. In other words, Vikings. Hey, do you know how these Northmen communicated? They used Norse code. Norse code, because it sounds like Morse code. Anyway, Rollo and his Viking army had been plundering the rich Seine River Valley in France for years. Charles the Simple was the king of France but held little power. Charles granted the Viking leader a huge piece of French territory in the north. It became known as Northmen's Land, or Normandy. In return, Rollo swore a pledge of loyalty to the king. Wait, what's going on? Oh, according to legend, when required to kiss the foot of King Charles as a condition of the treaty, Rollo refused to perform such a humiliating act. Rollo ordered one of his warriors to do it, so his warrior lifted Charles' foot up to his mouth, causing the king to fall to the ground. Oh, I get it. The worst years of the invaders' attacks in Western Europe spanned roughly 850 to 950 CE. During this time, rulers and warriors like Charles and Rollo made similar agreements in many parts of Europe. The system of governing and landholding, called feudalism, had emerged in Europe. Feudalism was a political system in which nobles were granted the use of land that legally belonged to the king. A similar feudal system existed in China under the Zhou dynasty, which ruled from around the 11th century BCE until 256 BCE, while feudalism in Japan began in 1192 CE and ended in the 19th century. In the European feudal system, status determined a person's prestige and power. Medieval writers classified people into three groups: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. Social class was usually inherited. The structure of feudal society was shaped like a pyramid and was based on relationships of rights and obligations. At the top reigned the king.
I'm your king. Well, I didn't vote for you.
Oh, by the way, where did the Burger King take the Dairy Queen for their first date? To the White Castle. Anyway, the king is at the top. The king controlled the land in the kingdom, but was weak without a strong army. To defend their territories, kings raised private armies of knights, mounted horsemen who pledged to defend their lord's lands. In exchange for military service and some taxes, kings rewarded knights, their most skilled warriors, with fiefs from their sprawling estates. A fief is granted land that the vassal, the person receiving the fief, could use to generate wealth, allowing knights to devote their lives to war. Oh, so that means Charles the Simple, the king and lord, meaning he controlled the land, granted his land to Rollo, his vassal. Oh, and vassals could also be lords with another vassal below them. Anyway, knights could then afford to pay for costly weapons, armor, and war horses, and were expected to serve maybe 40 days of military service, or at least send someone to serve for them. The two-sided bargain continued below the most powerful vassals, who were the wealthy landowners such as nobles and bishops. The same relationship existed between the lesser lords and the lords above them. Military service and taxes for a fief and protection. At the base of the pyramid were the landless peasants who toiled in the fields. Hey, the modern chessboard can be used to illustrate feudalism. The king and the queen pieces are placed at the middle, just as the monarchy was central to feudal society. Next to them, the next most powerful force in medieval life, stand the bishops, representing the church. The knights represent the professional warriors who fought on horseback, so it makes sense they're represented by the horse. At the corners of the board stands a rook. These castles represent the home of the king, an important line of defense for the monarch. The 8 pawns on the board represent the peasants and serfs. Notice that the pawns can't travel very far very quickly, and are the least valuable pieces on the board. Oh yeah, not represented in chess and residing outside of the feudalistic bonds were the franklin or freemen. They were often people like the blacksmith or carpenter. In Europe in the Middle Ages,
we really are in medieval times.
Yes, medieval times. The vast majority of people were peasants. Most peasants were serfs. Serfs were people who could not lawfully leave the place where they were born. Though bound to the land, serfs were not slaves. Their lords could not sell or buy them, but what their labor produced belonged to the lord. The manor was the lord's estate on the fief. During the Middle Ages, the manor system was the basic economic arrangement. The manor system rested on a set of rights and obligations between a lord and his serfs. The lord provided the serfs with housing, farmland, and protection from bandits and barbarians. In return, serfs tended the lord's lands, cared for his animals, and performed other tasks to maintain the estate. Peasant women shared in the farm work with their husbands. All peasants, whether free or serf, owed the lord certain duties. These included at least a few days of labor each week and a certain portion of their grain. Peasants rarely traveled more than 25 miles from their own manor. By standing in the center of a plowed field, they could see their entire world at a glance. A manor usually covered only a few square miles of land. It typically consisted of the Lord's manor house, a church, and workshops. Generally, 15 to 30 families lived in the village on a manor. Fields, pastures, and woodlands surrounded the village. Sometimes a stream wound through the land. Streams and ponds provided fish, which served as an important source of food. The mill for grinding the grain was often located on the stream. The economic side of feudalism was the manor. Due to the dangers of warfare, little trade occurred, so the manor was largely a self-sufficient community. The serfs and peasants raised or produced nearly everything that they and their lord needed for daily life. You name it: crops, milk, cheese, fuel, cloth, leather goods, and lumber. For the privilege of living on the Lord's land, peasants paid a high price. They paid a tax on all grain ground in the Lord's mill. Any attempt to avoid taxes by baking bread elsewhere was treated as a crime. Peasants also paid a tax on marriage. Weddings could take place only with the Lord's consent. After all these payments to the Lord, peasant families also owed the village priest a tithe, or church tax. A tithe represented 1/10 of their income. Serfs lived in crowded cottages close to their neighbors. The cottages only had 1 or 2 rooms. If there were 2 rooms, the main room was used for cooking, eating, and household activities. The second was the family bedroom. Peasants warmed their dirt floor houses by bringing pigs inside. At night, the family huddled on a pile of straw that often crawled with insects. Peasants' simple diet consisted mainly of vegetables, coarse brown bread, grain, cheese, and soup. The serfs' days revolved around raising crops and livestock and taking care of home and family. As soon as children were old enough, they were put to work in the fields or in the home. Many children did not survive to adulthood. Illness and malnutrition were constant afflictions for medieval peasants. Average life expectancy was about 35 years. Yet despite the hardships they endured, serfs accepted their lot in life as part of the church's teachings. They, like most Christians during medieval times, believed that God determined a person's place in society and that they would be rewarded in the afterlife.
I'm your king. Well, I didn't vote for you.